Picture a synagogue in Antioch, sometime in the middle of the 1st century. A man unrolls a new scroll. Carefully, the way you handle something you sense is going to matter. He does not know yet that this document will become the most widely copied text in human history. He only knows someone handed it to him and said, "Read this." He reads the first line aloud. "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." That phrase carries a weight you cannot fully feel unless you were raised Jewish, raised on the Psalms, raised waiting for something that has been promised for 1,000 years. Every time a rabbi read aloud from the prophet Isaiah, "And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of the increase of his government there shall be no end upon the throne of David." Every Jewish child in the room understood that throne is empty. That king is still coming, and when he comes, you will know him because he will be the son of David. So the man in the synagogue hears those 4 words, "Son of David," and he leans forward. He keeps reading. He moves through names, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and then, right there in the 4th generation, a woman. Her name is Tamar. And if you knew anything about Tamar's story, you would know that her presence here is startling. Because women do not appear in Jewish genealogies like this, not in royal lineages, not in legal documents establishing a man's right to inherit a throne. He keeps reading. More names, more men, and then another woman, Rahab, and then Ruth, and then simply the wife of Uriah, and then at the very end, Mary. And then Matthew says something that makes this man look up from the scroll and start counting. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 14. He counts again from David to the exile, and again from Babylon to Jesus. Then he frowns, because the second group does not add up the way it should. Between a king named Joram and a king named Uzziah, the list skips, and 3 actual historical kings of Judah are simply gone. Matthew says 14 generations, but when you count the names Matthew actually wrote in that section, you are standing in a gap. Something has been left out. And here is what nobody tells you when they read Matthew chapter 1 aloud in December. This was not an accident. This was not a scribal error. This was not a mistake that Matthew hoped nobody would notice. This was the point. This is not a census. This is not a birth certificate. This is not a list of relatives Jesus might have recognized at a family gathering. This is a theological argument embedded in arithmetic, written in a code that every Jewish reader of the 1st century would have recognized within seconds. And when you see the name hiding inside that math, you will never read this chapter the same way again. Stay with me. To understand what Matthew is doing, you need to know something about the Hebrew language that almost nobody teaches in a Sunday morning service. In Hebrew, letters are also numbers. Every letter in the Hebrew alphabet carries a numerical value. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, Dalet is 4, Vav is 6, and so on through the entire alphabet. This system is called Gematria, and you need to understand that in the 1st century, this was not fringe scholarship. It was not superstition. It was not the Jewish equivalent of reading your horoscope. It was a standard feature of how educated Jewish people read texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls show evidence of Gematria. The Talmud references it. The apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period is saturated with it. When a Jewish reader saw a significant number repeated in a religious text, they asked an automatic question: what name does this number spell? Matthew knew they would ask that question. He was counting on it. Because the name he kept pointing to, the name he wrote in his very first sentence, and then buried mathematically into the structure of his entire first chapter, carries a number that unlocks everything. The name is David. In Hebrew, David is spelled with 3 letters, Dalet, Vav, Dalet. Dalet equals 4. Vav equals 6. Dalet equals 4 again. 4 plus 6 plus 4. The numerical value of the name David is 14. Now go back to Matthew chapter 1. 14 generations from Abraham to David. 14 generations from David to the exile. 14 generations from the exile to Christ. That number does not appear 3 times because Matthew liked symmetry or happened to enjoy neat groupings. The number appears 3 times because Matthew was writing the name David into the structure of history itself. 3 sets of 14, 3 times the name of the king. 3 mathematical declarations that the man who stands at the very end of this list is the royal heir, the one the prophets promised, the son of David, who will sit on David's throne forever. When that first-century Jewish reader in Antioch counted the names and hit 14 3 times, he did not see arithmetic. He saw a name. He saw David, 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 and he understood that Jesus was not just another name at the bottom of a long list. Jesus was the destination the entire list had been building toward for 2,000 years. Now watch what happens next. Because Matthew doesn't just write the number 3 times. He divides all of history into 3 eras, and each era carries its own weight, its own emotion, its own chapter of Israel's story. Era 1, Abraham to David. This is the era of promise becoming kingdom. You have to understand what Abraham was before you can appreciate what he became. He was not a religious leader. He was not a prophet with a following. He was a wandering shepherd from a city in Mesopotamia called Ur, a man with no land, no heir, and no reason to believe that the voice he heard was anything other than his own longing playing tricks. And yet the promise came anyway. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Your offspring will bless all the nations of the earth. And over the next 1,000 years, that wandering shepherd's family became a nation, and that nation produced a king, a shepherd actually, the son of Jesse, who was the son of Obed, who was the son of Ruth. And we will come back to Ruth, who was the son of Boaz. Era 1 ends with a throne established, a kingdom real, a son of Abraham finally sitting in the city of David. The promise kept. Era 2, David to the exile. This is the era of kingdom becoming ash. Solomon builds the temple and then tears apart the covenant with his own idolatry. The kingdom splits in 2, north and south, Israel and Judah, and the 2 halves spend the next 3 centuries trying to out-sin each other. Some kings chase after God with everything they have. Others build altars to foreign gods in the shadow of the temple walls. And then, in the year we now call 607 BC, the Babylonian army arrives. Nebuchadnezzar tears down the temple. He scatters the priests. He drags the king, a young man named Jeconiah, just 18 years old, in chains to Babylon. The throne is empty. The city is silent. The prophet Jeremiah sits in the rubble of Jerusalem and writes a poem made entirely of grief. It is still in your Bible. You know it as Lamentations. Era 2 ends not with triumph, but with weeping by the rivers of a foreign country. Era 3, exile to Christ. This is the era of ash becoming hope. The people return from Babylon, but not to a restored kingdom. They come back to a city that must be rebuilt stone by stone. For 500 years after the exile, there is no king on David's throne. The line continues, but in private. Ordinary men and women carrying a royal bloodline through centuries of foreign occupation, first Persia, then Greece, then the armies of Rome. And then, in a small hill town in Galilee that nobody in the wider world had ever heard of, a young woman named Mary receives a visitor she did not expect. 3 eras. Rise, fall, restoration, each one sealed with the same number, each number spelling the same name. David, David, David. And you are supposed to ask yourself, why is Matthew so committed to this number? Why structure history this way? Because Matthew knew his audience. He was not writing for Rome. He was not writing for Greece. He was writing for Jewish people who had memorized entire Psalms, who knew the names of every king of Judah, who had been told all their lives that the Messiah would come from the house of David, and who had spent 400 years of silence wondering if God had forgotten. Matthew's first chapter is his answer to 400 years of silence. He is saying, in the language of numbers, in the language they will immediately recognize, the count is complete. The name has appeared at the end of history. The king is here. Now, before we go any further, if you have never thought about the genealogy this way before, and something is shifting for you right now, this is a great place to hit subscribe. Because there is a lot more hiding in these pages, and you do not want to miss it. Let me come back to something I said at the beginning. The numbers do not quite add up. Matthew says the second group, from David to the Babylonian exile, contains 14 generations. But when you count the names he actually listed in that section, you find a hole. Between a king named Joram and a king named Uzziah, Matthew wrote, "And Joram the father of Uzziah." But the historical record, the books of Kings and Chronicles, tells a different story. Between Joram and Uzziah, 3 kings sat on the throne of David. Their names were Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. 3 real men, 3 historical figures. 3 kings whose stories are recorded in your Old Testament. Matthew left them out. And here is where people sometimes get nervous. Did Matthew make a mistake? Was he confused? Is the genealogy inaccurate? No. And the answer to why reveals something stunning about how the ancient world understood the very purpose of a genealogy. In the first century, a genealogy was not a census. You were not legally or morally required to list every biological descendant in an unbroken chain from father to son. What you were doing was establishing legal and theological identity, tracing the line of covenant, the line of promise, the line of legitimate inheritance. Jewish rabbis of Matthew's era commonly compressed genealogies, skipping generations whenever the theological argument required it. The Hebrew word for father could mean grandfather or great-grandfather or any ancestor in the direct line. Matthew was doing exactly what any educated Jewish author of his time would do, selecting the names that served his argument. But why these 3 names? Why Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah specifically? Pay attention to this. All 3 of those kings were direct descendants of a single woman named Athaliah, and Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. When the northern Israelite royal family entered the southern Davidic dynasty through a political marriage, it brought with it the bloodline of the most notorious idolaters in Israel's entire history. Athaliah herself eventually seized the throne of Judah and ordered the execution of every member of the Davidic royal family. She came within one hidden infant of destroying the very lineage Matthew is tracing. Matthew removed those 3 kings from his genealogy not because he forgot them. He removed them as a deliberate theological statement. The bloodline of Jezebel does not belong in the genealogy of the Messiah. The arithmetic required 14. The theology required cutting a poisoned branch. And Matthew did both at once, with the quiet precision of a man who had spent years working with numbers before he ever picked up a pen to write about Jesus. Now, about those women. There are 5 of them in a list that spans 2,000 years of almost exclusively male names. In a first-century Jewish genealogy, this is not just unusual, it is startling. Women appeared in lineages only under exceptional circumstances, and the 5 women Matthew chose are not the obvious ones. He does not mention Sarah, the mother of Isaac. He does not mention Rebekah. He does not mention Rachel. He picks 5 women whose stories carry a kind of holy disruption. 5 women who should not be here by every conventional measure of the ancient world. And yet, here they are. Tamar, a Canaanite woman who married into the tribe of Judah, was twice widowed by Judah's own sons and was then denied the legal rights she was owed by her father-in-law. She took matters into her own hands in a way that shocked everyone around her. And yet Judah himself said, "She is more righteous than I." She is in the royal bloodline of David. Rahab, a woman in the city of Jericho whose profession the Bible describes without softening. When Israelite spies came to scout the city before Joshua's army arrived, she hid them, protected them, and made a deal, a scarlet cord in her window, and her family would be spared. She is listed here as the mother of Boaz, which means she is the grandmother of Ruth, the great-great-grandmother of David. Ruth, a Moabite. The people of Moab were traditionally excluded from the assembly of Israel for 10 generations, according to the law of Deuteronomy. Ruth was a Gentile widow who refused to leave her Jewish mother-in-law after both their husbands died. She crossed a border she was not supposed to cross, entered a community that had every legal right to reject her, and said the words that 2,000 years of Christians have quoted at weddings without fully reckoning with how radical they were. "Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God." She is the great-grandmother of David, the wife of Uriah. Matthew does not even give her name. He does not call her Bathsheba. He calls her the wife of Uriah, a deliberate reminder of the worst chapter in David's biography. David saw her from a rooftop. He summoned her. He arranged the death of her husband, a loyal soldier, to cover what he had done. And yet from that union, from that story of power abused and a woman caught in the wreckage, came Solomon, and from Solomon came the long chain of kings that eventually led to Joseph, and then Mary, an unmarried girl in a village so obscure that when one of Jesus' future disciples first heard that the Messiah came from there, his response was, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" A woman with a complicated past who hid spies and tied a red cord in her window. A Moabite who crossed every boundary to follow the God of a people who were not her own. A woman whose tragedy was used and then redeemed, and a village girl who said yes to something she did not fully understand. Here's what most people miss. Those 5 women are not footnotes. They are the thesis statement of the entire gospel. Before Jesus has healed a single person, before he has spoken a single parable, Matthew is announcing what kind of kingdom this will be. A kingdom that makes room for everyone the kingdoms of men have discarded. A kingdom where your background does not disqualify you. A kingdom where God takes the stories that look disqualified and puts them in the royal line. Now I need to tell you about Jeconiah. Jeconiah, also called Jehoiachin, was the king of Judah who was dragged into Babylon. He was 18 years old when Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded Jerusalem. He surrendered the city within 3 months. He watched the temple burn from a distance. He spent the next 37 years as a prisoner in Babylon until a new king eventually released him and gave him a seat at the royal table. Jeconiah lived long enough to die in exile, never seeing Jerusalem again, and the prophet Jeremiah pronounced a curse over him. "Write this man down as childless," Jeremiah declared, "for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah." He appears twice, once at the end of the second group, once at the opening of the third. He is the pivot between exile and return. He is also, if you trace the line forward, the direct biological ancestor of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And here is where you have to sit with the full weight of what Matthew has constructed. Joseph was the legal father of Jesus. He gave Jesus his name. He registered him, raised him, claimed him. In the ancient world, legal paternity was the basis of royal inheritance. To inherit the throne of David, Jesus needed to be the legal son of Joseph. And he was. Matthew establishes this clearly. But if Joseph was a biological descendant of Jeconiah, the cursed king, then Jeremiah's declaration seemed to block Jesus from ever sitting on David's throne. No descendant of Jeconiah, the prophet said, would rule. Except Jesus was not Joseph's biological son. He shared no genetics with Jeconiah. The curse could not travel to him through blood because there was no blood connection. But the royal inheritance, the legal right to the throne of David, came to him through Joseph's name, through Joseph's act of adoption, through one man's decision to claim a child as his own. This was not a legal loophole that God stumbled upon. This is the architecture. Think about what it means that a carpenter in Nazareth chose to give his name to a child who was not his by birth. In doing that one quiet act, probably in the dark, probably without fanfare, probably without understanding the full weight of what he was doing, Joseph handed Jesus the legal inheritance of a 1,000-year-old royal dynasty without passing along the curse that came with it. Not in the sense of coincidence, not in the sense of history moving blindly forward and stumbling into a good outcome, not in the sense of God improvising at the last moment, in the sense of someone who planned this and planned it so precisely that the solution to a curse pronounced 6 centuries before Jesus was born was already built into the structure of how Jesus would enter the world. Think about what it means to compose a symphony. A great composer does not sit down and write beautiful notes at random. Every phrase, every harmonic shift, every moment of dissonance serves a purpose you may not hear until the final movement. You can be 10 minutes into a Beethoven symphony before you realize that a theme introduced in the first 30 seconds was the key to the entire architecture. The dissonance you heard in the second movement was not a mistake. It was a preparation. It was the sound of tension being wound up so that when the resolution finally comes, you feel it in your chest. Matthew chapter 1 is that. The whole chapter is the first movement of a symphony that ends at a cross and an empty tomb. The 3:14s are the opening theme. The 5 women are the unexpected harmonies that change the color of everything. The three missing kings are the notes Matthew chose not to play. And Jeconiah is the dissonance, the moment that sounds like it breaks the structure until the resolution arrives in the form of a carpenter who chose to be a father. God composed this, not in a vague sense, in the specific sense that someone arranged for a Moabite widow to cross a border and marry a Jewish farmer in Bethlehem. Someone arranged for a disgraced, cursed king to survive exile and pass his bloodline forward through 600 years of obscurity. Someone arranged for that line to find its way to a carpenter in Nazareth, so that when the moment came, the legal inheritance of David's throne could pass to a child through a name, without the curse that the blood carried. And then Matthew, the man who once sat at a toll booth counting other people's money for Rome, the man who left everything the moment Jesus looked at him across that table. This man sat down to write the most important document of his life, and he began it not with a miracle, not with an angel, not with a sermon. He began it with a genealogy, with numbers, with the quiet, precise, authoritative voice of a man who wants you to understand. This was planned before you were born. This was structured before Jerusalem fell. This was coming before Abraham left Ur. And the proof is in the arithmetic, David, 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 3 times. In the bones of history itself, 3 things to take with you. First, the number 14 is not a coincidence, not a memory device, not Matthew showing off his arithmetic. The numerical value of the name David in Hebrew is 14. Matthew stamped that name 3 times into the structure of history to announce, before Jesus has spoken a single word, before he has touched a single sick person, that the royal heir of Israel has arrived. When you read 14 generations 3 times in Matthew chapter 1, you are hearing a name. David, 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 and the son of David is here. Second, the 5 women in that genealogy are not anomalies. They are a proclamation. Tamar, who secured justice outside the system. Rahab, whose past was complicated and whose faith was extraordinary. Ruth, who crossed every boundary to follow a God who was not yet hers. The wife of Uriah, whose tragedy became part of a redemption story bigger than her suffering. And Mary, who said yes to something she did not fully understand. Every person that the religious systems of the ancient world would have considered disqualified, wrong background, wrong history, wrong story, Matthew put them in the royal line on purpose. The genealogy is telling you, before the gospel even starts, what kind of Messiah is coming. Third, this genealogy is not a list of perfect people. It is a record of how God works through imperfect ones, through exiled kings and foreign women, through broken covenants and unlikely adoptions, through a curse that seemed to close a door and one man's quiet act of fatherhood that opened it again. If you have ever looked at your own history and thought the damage is too old, the failures too deep, the gaps too wide for God to build anything meaningful through you, look at this list. God built the lineage of salvation through every kind of brokenness you can name. Which name in Matthew's genealogy surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments below. The genealogy ends with a man named Joseph, who gave his name to a child who was not his by blood. That act of love, quiet, unannounced, irreversible, completed a plan 2,000 years in the making. It was never an accident. It was always a plan.